Hey guys, Brian from Boas here. One of my favorite things about running this channel is I get so many great questions from you guys, and today I thought I'd take a few minutes and answer some of the questions about boas I've been asked recently. But before I get to that, I just wanted to mention that I'm having a special end of the season sale. We've got about a month left of shipping weather before it's going to get too cold to ship. So I've taken a 25% discount off of all of my baby boas available on my Flickr site. And you can see the link to my Flickr site below the video description. Go check out those boas. The prices have been reduced by 25%. And these discounts are only good for upfront payments, no payment plans, and all boas need to be shipped by the beginning of December. Okay, so let's get to the questions. First question. Do you feed more heavily before pairing? The answer is yes. In general, I do feed animals more heavily before pairing because I want to get them up to a condition that they can sustain not feeding for about 2 months or so, and then less feeding for the next few months. And this is especially true for the females because they're going to have to put a huge amount of energy into producing the babies. So in the summer, I'll typically increase the frequency and or the size of the meals, not that much, but enough so that they can put on a little bit of extra weight. Okay, next question. And the context of this question, someone asked me about call key and cocker key boas and whether they were inbred or not, and is there new genes available? And so my answer to that question was no. Unfortunately, it's unlikely that we're going to get any new genes coming in from the wild because these animals are fully protected in the wild. They're not exported for captivity. But the thing to keep in mind is that boas that live on an island are highly likely to be very highly inbred anyway, because we're dealing with a small population on a small piece of land. There's no introduction of unrelated boas, and so basically they're just inbreeding generation after generation. And I've done videos about inbreeding before where I went into a lot more detail. Check those out if you're interested. But when animals inbreed, the end result is that they become more genetically homogeneous. Basically, inbreeding gets rid of genetic variability, and in an extreme example, you could have siblings which are functionally all identical clones. And typically in an inbreeding situation there are detrimental effects and it doesn't get that far, but there are examples where there hasn't been detrimental effects and they've gone pretty much that far. And so the reason I'm not worried about inbreeding with island boas is that these animals exist naturally without any obvious diseases, or they appear healthy. Even though they are in a very small population in the wild, they've likely been that way for thousands of years. And if there were any deleterious effects, it would have cropped up by now and the population wouldn't have been self-sustaining. But the fact that they can exist in this state in the wild indicates it's pretty unlikely that there's a lot of negative genetic diseases in the population because it wouldn't have been able to sustain itself. So for that respect, I'm not as worried about the lack of genetic diversity with the island boas. With other types of boas, it's always a good idea, as much as possible, to introduce unrelated animals to your breeding group to prevent inbreeding depression. Okay, next question. What substrate do you use? Well, pretty simple answer. I use coco coir substrate for most of my animals. I use paper towels for the babies, and for some of my animals I use newspaper if I need to make a quick substrate change. For my breedings animals, my gravid females, I typically use newspaper. There's no one perfect substrate. They all have pros and cons, and I've done videos before about substrates. I've tried pretty much all the substrates there are, and I've settled on largely just those three. Next, are Guyana BCC bigger than Suriname BCC? So my answer to this is pretty simple, no, because Guyana BCC and Suriname BCC, for all intents and purposes, are the same animal. And I've done a video on this, and I've mentioned this a lot over the time that my channel's been on the air. But Guyana BCC really are the same species, same subspecies. In the wild, they can interbreed with Suriname BCC. So there is no difference And so the adult size is likely to be the same for both of them. And although the maximal potential size is probably around 13 feet, the vast majority of adult BCC from Guyana or Suriname are somewhere in the 6 to 8 foot range. Okay. One last thought on that is that, yes, it's certainly possible that one Guyana is going to be different from one Suriname. But when I say that there's not difference between the two, I mean that the genetic differences between all the animals from Guyana and all the animals from Suriname within that population are likely to be no different from animals from the entire interbreeding population between Guyana and Suriname. And the people debate about this over and over again, and there's like a million other reasons why you shouldn't really be all that concerned about the whole Suriname versus Guyana debate, but check out my video, Guyana versus Suriname Redtail, Is There a Difference, for more discussion. Next question, how many slugs do you get per litter? Well, that depends. Ideally, I get 0 per litter. Worst case scenario, the entire litter is nothing but slugs. And so I'd say probably about half of my litters, I don't get any slugs, nice healthy babies. I would say probably about 10%, unfortunately, are all slugs. The animal just slugs out. And that happened to me a few times last year. And then often I'll see a litter of, about a dozen or so babies, and there's 2 or 3 slugs. It's another pretty common scenario. I'd say it happens about 25% of the time or so. And slugs are probably related to the sperm quality and or quantity, or lack thereof. And unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a lot you can do to completely prevent the slugs. Okay, next question. Do you ship snakes to Europe? Short answer, no, I don't. Long answer, unfortunately, shipping an animal across the pond is a hell of a lot more complicated than it should be due to all of the laws and restrictions. There is a service that can actually import animals into Europe, but I looked into it at one point. It was really, really expensive. And, I was going to have to ship my animals to someone in the US, and then they were going to have to go from there to Europe. So basically it was like, 2 totally separate shipping experiences. And when I thought about it, just the stress on the snakes, I feel bad enough shipping them once within the country, but then thinking about them at this intermediate point, not being sure how they're going to be handled or treated at the intermediate point, but then they have to be shipped to Europe, and I'm really not sure what's going to happen to them there. So as much as I would love to have my animals go to Europe and add their genetic diversity to the European captive boa constrictor populations, it's just really not practical at this point. But hopefully in the future that will change. Thought I'd give that Suriname redtail a break and grab this Tarahumara female for eye candy for you to look at while I'm answering the questions. Next question, ironically, is about redtails. What redtail locality has the longest, brightest tail? Well, that's a little bit open to debate, but my money is on the Suriname redtail as far as having the longest, brightest red tail. The length and brightness of the tail also have to do with the bloodline and if it's been selectively bred, but in general, the Surinames have the longest red tails. If you saw my question about Guyana boas a few questions ago, since Guyana is effectively the same thing as Suriname, it also applies to the Guyana boas. That doesn't mean that every boa from Suriname or Guyana has a long red tail. I've seen some that have a short tail that's really not all that bright red. I've seen others that have more of a maroon colored tail, kind of a brownish red. I've seen some that have this bright fire engine kind of orangey red, and some have kind of more of a deep crimson red. And a lot of my red tails, like from my Prometheus line, have kind of that more dark crimson red, kind of a deeper red, but still bright. And they also have the long red tails. Sometimes people will count the number of tail saddles. Boas with a long red tail typically have about 8 of those bright red tail saddles. Some have up to 10. That's like the maximum I've seen. And then others only have like 5 or 6, but the shape and the symmetry is just so great that it doesn't matter that they have fewer tail saddles. There there's a lot of really beautiful looks to red-tailed boas, so don't get in this mindset that the boa has to look exactly of what you think is an ideal red-tail for it to be a knockout animal. Okay, a few more questions. Another red-tail question: do true red-tails darken with age? Well, this depends. It depends on the type or the bloodline of the red-tail. It depends upon the diet, environmental factors like that. But some animals will darken up with age. I've seen some red-tails that get much darker, almost like a melanistic type of change, like an IMG or a longicata. They just get more dark pigment as they get older. Sometimes the colors become more kind of washed out looking. And that's true with boas in general. If you're following morph boas, you might notice that people almost always are showing pictures of baby morph boas, because for many morphs, especially the brightly colored ones, they look the best as babies and then they kind of fade and get washed out as they get older. The classic example are some of the albinos that as adults, sometimes they're just kind of this dull, washed out yellowish color, whereas as babies they were much brighter. And it's true to some extent with the red tails, not nearly as much as with some morphs, but they do become a little less bright in many cases as they get older. And then older animals that are older than 15 or so will start to kind of look older. I mean, everything with age, it kind of looks a little more beat up and haggard, but unfortunately that's true with snakes as well. And I will say though that with red tails, many of them I would say peak during early adulthood, because as babies they're kind of a little bit more on the gray side, and then they start to get more brightly colored as they get older, and then they reach adulthood at around 5 years or so, and that's probably when they're at their peak appearance wise. And then from then on, a lot of red tails look nice up till 10, 15. I mean, even really old ones can look nice as well, but they just look a little older and maybe a little more washed out. Which kind of makes sense when you think about it. Same thing with humans. I mean, humans kind of peak in their early 20s appearance-wise. By the time you get to, 50 years old like me, you're kind of on the downhill trajectory. All right, last question here. Do you recommend cycling for non-breeder pet boas? And so that answer to that depends. For many non-breeder pet boas, it is a good idea to cycle. By cycle, I mean drop the temperature slightly over the winter months from about November through like February. Maybe drop it for about 10 to 15 degrees just at night. And you should also cycle the feeding. Stop feeding them over those same months. They can fast for 2.5 months. And that's actually a good idea for a lot of pet boas, because in captivity there's a tendency to overfeed them, so they start to get really chunky. And one of the best ways to maintain a nice lean body is to have that winter fast. And so even if you have a pet boa that you're not going to breed, I would recommend that you do it. If your boa is underweight, or if you don't really feed your boa that much, it's okay not to do it. It's not required. In fact, it's not even really required for breeders. Sometimes breeders can breed without any cycling. But in general, people who are breeding boas, they do this cycling because it conditions their animals and gives them the cues in order to mate successfully and to have a successful litter. So some thoughts on cycling. Anyway, those are the questions for today. Hope I touched on something you've been wondering about. As always, keep the questions coming. I'll do more videos like this in the future. Thank you for watching, and enjoy your boas.